So today's big fear, lack of hairspray. So my wife and daughter used all the hairspray, left me with just enough for maybe like one squirt right here in the front. And like this hair, like it requires a ton of hairspray to stay in place. So what's gonna happen today? Everything is so uncertain. I don't know if my hair's gonna fall, what I'm gonna look like at the end of the day. I mean, these are first world problems, but they're real, right? Good morning, Chief. Look at Chief. He's a good dog. So anyway, that's my big fear for the day. That as the day goes on, I'm going to look uglier and uglier. And I don't need much help in that category. So I gotta do something about that. So like, what's your fear? I don't mean like, what are you scared of? Like you're scared of spiders, or you're scared of snakes, or scared of having a flat tire on the side of the road. I mean, what are you like really afraid of? What is that fear that really holds you back from being all that you can be, or that causes you to make bad decisions because you're afraid of what could happen, or you're trying to protect yourself in some way from this fear coming true? Or maybe it's a fear that keeps you from making good decisions. Like you're afraid to step out and really take a risk for fear that this might happen. What is that thing for you? I think for me, one of the biggest fears I've had in my life is that my life would mean nothing, that it would account for nothing. You know, like I would die and leave this world, and the only people that would remember me or any of my contributions would be my children, maybe my grandchildren, but that I would mean nothing to this world that I've lived in. That's affected some of my decision making over the years. The fear of purposelessness or meaninglessness. What's your fear? So, Abraham is presented as one of the great men of faith in the Bible. He's faithful to God, and his faith is strong. He trusts God. In fact, in Hebrews chapter 11, Abraham is represented in what we call the Great Hall of Faith. And we're told in Hebrews 11 that it's Abraham's faith in God that was the source of his salvation. His righteousness, his right standing before God, was because he had faith in God. And even though Abraham is this great man of faith, there are times in Abraham's life when he allows fear to rule him and to be the force that drives his decision making. So in Genesis chapter 12, at the beginning of the chapter, God establishes his covenant with Abraham. His name's Abram at this point. And God tells him that he's going to make him a great nation, that his offspring or his, the people that come after him, his children, grandchildren, that they're going to be countless, as numerous as the stars, that God's going to make a great nation out of him. He's going to give him the land that he's living in. And he's going to be great. And then in the latter half of Genesis 12, a famine strikes the land. And so Abram decides to go down to Egypt to escape the famine. And as he goes down there, he starts to think about how beautiful his wife Sarah is. And he tells her, hey, look, we're going down to Egypt, and some folks may think that you're really beautiful and want to take you as their wife. So tell everybody you're my sister, because I'm afraid they're going to kill me and take you away from me. So out of fear for his own life, he tells his wife to tell a half truth, which is really a whole lie. And I say a half truth because it's kind of true that Sarah is his sister. She's his half sister. She is the daughter of his father, but from a different mother. So I know that's weird nowadays, but back then, I guess it wasn't that big of a deal. Still, though, rather than being upfront and just telling everybody, look, this is my wife, he wants her to tell folks she's his sister because he's afraid. And sure enough, he gets down to Egypt, and word gets to Pharaoh about how beautiful Sarah is. And so Pharaoh takes Sarah to be his wife, which she's already Abraham's wife. So in essence, Sarah is being forced into this adulterous relationship with Pharaoh. And this had to have gone on for a little while, because the Bible tells us that in Genesis 12:16 that Abraham, again Abram at this point, became very rich because he was in the good favor of Pharaoh because of Sarah. And so he amassed great herds of sheep and donkeys and camels and, all of the things that would have made cattle, all of the things that would have set a person apart as being rich in those days. And this makes sense. I mean, Abraham is the supposed brother-in-law to Pharaoh now, because Pharaoh has married Sarah. And wow, this is a tangled mess, right? And finally, God reveals to Pharaoh, God intervenes and reveals to Pharaoh the truth of Sarah and Abraham's relationship. Pharaoh realizes that, he's done wrong and that there's a penalty for what he's done. The Bible tells us that God sent plagues on Egypt because of this. And so Pharaoh does the right thing. He gives Sarah back to Abraham and sends Abraham on his way with all of the things all the stuff that Abram has amassed while he's there in Egypt. And so then a few chapters later, God, still working with Abram, gives Abraham the Abrahamic covenant, where he makes this promise to him again that he's going to make Abraham a great nation. And the Bible again tells us that Abraham believes God, and God tells him he's going to give him a son, and that son is going to come through Sarah. God tells him this. Well, Abraham, being who Abraham is, and the fact that God's taken a little while to come through on his promise, Abraham decides to take things into his own hands. And so he begins a relationship with Sarah's handmaid Hagar and has a son with her, whom he names Ishmael.
And this, interestingly enough, because he's got this fear of having no offspring, no one to hand all of this stuff that he's amassed down. In fact, that's part of what he tells God is, hey, I don't have any children. You're making me all these promises. I don't have any children. The highest servant in my house is going to be my heir because you've not given me any kids. And God tells him, I'm going to give you a kid. I'm going to give you a kid through Sarah. But again, Abraham, out of fear, takes things into his own hands, and he has a kid with Hagar. And from that point on, things are just not good in Abraham's home. Hagar and Sarah begin to have issues because now Hagar has a kid, Sarah doesn't have a kid, and Sarah becomes really jealous. So God comes back to Abraham again and tells him in Genesis 17, hey, look, I'm still going to keep this covenant. I'm still going to make you a great nation, and it is going to come through Sarah, not Hagar, not where you've tried to take things into your own hands. And Abraham actually tries to convince God to bless Ishmael, and God says, no, I'm doing it my way. I'm doing it the way I told you I was going to do it. And he says, I'm going to give you a child through Sarah. And he clearly tells him that Sarah is going to be the one who bears him a son, and that God is going to establish his covenant with that son and carry out all of his promises through that son. And so what's interesting about this is this is Genesis 15. Just 5 chapters later, in Genesis 20, okay, follow me here. In Genesis 20, Isaac has not been conceived yet. The promise is still looming out there. And Abraham ends up living in the land of Gerar, and again is worried that the beauty of his wife is going to be an issue for him. So he again tells people that she's his sister, not his wife. And King Abimelech now takes her to be his wife. So again, fear is ruling Abraham's decision making. And this time God comes to Abimelech before Abimelech can even consummate their marriage or their relationship, and informs him that Sarah is really Abraham's wife, and that if he carries through with his decision to make Sarah his wife, that it's going to create some dire consequences for Abimelech and his people. So Abimelech comes back to Abraham and says, why have you done this? Why have you told us this lie? And he gives Sarah back and, sends Abraham on his way. And then not long after all of this happened, Sarah actually conceived and became pregnant with Isaac, and Isaac was born. God's promise was consummated, I guess you could say. But think about how here is Abraham, who the Bible very clearly tells us he believed God, that God was going to do these things. And yet he kept finding himself in situations where his fear, rather than his faith, dictated what he did. And how many times did he do things that could have completely derailed the plan that God had for Abram and Sarah, or Abraham and Sarah? I guess the point is, Abraham was one of the greatest models of faith in the entire Bible, yet he often let fear be the deciding factor in his life. And that kind of leads to a question, because I think there's something we can learn here. God intervened in all of these different situations to kind of put things back on track and to protect Abraham and Sarah and to protect the plan and the purpose that he had for them. Could God have intervened just as much if Abraham had acted courageously and honestly in these situations as God did when he acted in fear? I would say absolutely yes, God could have done that. You know, rather than cleaning up Abraham's messes, God could have been blessing Abraham and doing amazing things because of his honesty and in his integrity and his character and his trust in God. You know, if God can clean up our messes, which he often does, when we do it all wrong, can't God also protect us when we try to do it right? And so all of these things that we're afraid of, that keep us from stepping out and being the people that God created us to be, can't God take care of those things? I wonder how many messes God has to clean up for us because of our fear that could have been times when God blessed us instead of times when we messed up and God had to clean up our messes. You know, I think God would rather bless than have to clean up a mess. And the interesting thing about how this all shakes out is that Isaac grows up, takes a wife. Her name's Rebecca. She's a beautiful lady as well. Isaac ends up in a very similar situation, living in the land of Gerar. And guess what Isaac does? Isaac tells everybody that Rebecca is his sister. And this time King Abimelech doesn't bite, but he catches them acting like a husband and wife would act, and he calls Isaac out on it. But catch the fact that Isaac perpetuated the sins of his father, and he took it a little further. Abraham at least could justify what he did by saying, yeah, Sarah technically is my half sister. Well, guess what? Rebecca was not Isaac's sister. He was her cousin. And so for him to tell people that Rebecca was his sister was an outright lie. So parents, that ought to give us pause to think about how the fears that drive our decision making can even be perpetuated and carried on by our children after us. So, yeah. What fears are holding you back, are holding you up, or are causing you to do some really bad things? Maybe some stupid things. Just a thought. I mean, when we talk about having fear over faith, we often apply that to some pretty silly situations. But I would suggest to you that faith, living by faith, is something that has to happen every day in every situation. And it should create a level of boldness in the way that we live that we just can't have when we live by fear. So look here, got me some hairspray. Sally's running a 4 for $20 deal on this Sebastian Shaper Plus knockoff that we use. So anyway, disaster averted. I don't have to be afraid anymore. My hair is going to last through the day.